it's not always easy to speak after people have had lunch because they usually slow down. So I will slow down as well in this instance. This afternoon, talking about law in respect of satellite jamming is really more difficult than talking about other issues, because usually there is a legal framework, there are identifiable areas that we can talk about in law. In this instance, there is, quite honestly, there is a vacuum. But I think probably I should start by putting things in context. We could talk on two levels. We could talk on the domestic level, and we could talk on the international level. Because satellites are at least housed in a country, transmit from a country. Therefore, there is domestic law which applies to them. And because it's satellite and goes to other countries, so it becomes transnational, it goes over the borders. So there is the domestic level and the international level, which probably we need to address them separately. The second aspect which we will probably look at is the idea of regulation as opposed to restrictions and censorship. These are two separate areas of structures. We are talking about a specific issue, which is the jamming. But I think one can also look at other instances which relates to the media. And I think I will start by telling you that there was a BBC World Service Arabic service here in London. And I used to be one of the earlier guests there. But that satellite station was done here, transmitted to Italy, and then from Italy it goes, I think it was called the RT or something, some other service company. But
Orbit.
Orbit, absolutely. It used to be sent by Orbit. But then there was a Saudi opposition person. His name is Mohammed al-Mis'ari, probably some of you know. The Arabs decided that he is a terrorist, and they wanted him out of Britain. They put pressure on Britain, and in this country, we usually adhere to pressures, but within a certain limit. So they thought, if we put Mis'ari before the court, issue an order for his deportation, and let him go to court and he loses the case, then that should be fine, we will deport him. Well, it didn't work that way. The court refused the application, uphold the application of Mohammed al-Mis'ari, kept him here. They tried again to send him another court. They tried a third time, whereby I think it is Grenada, where Britain gives Grenada something like £15,000 a year in aid. That year they gave them something like 150,000. And we had a letter from one of the senior politicians in charge of the Home Affairs in Grenada saying they will look after Mis'ari, because on the previous grounds the court upheld his objection on the basis that his life will be threatened if he's sent to Yemen or sent to other countries. So Grenada said we will guarantee his safety, and he stood before the judge and he said to him, he said, you know, my lord, I honestly don't even know where this country is. He said, might as well send me to the moon. He said, my family would not know where I am. Anyway, it was upheld. He had a press conference in one of the institutes in London, United Services Institute. And in the press conference, it was chaired by Lord Everbury, and one of the journalists from the BBC Arabic service said to Lord Everbury, he said, my lord, can I ask him a question in Arabic? And he answers in Arabic. He said to him, why are you doing that? He said, because I'm from the Arabic service. So he asked him the question. He said, Dr. Mis'ari, is it true that every time the news comes on BBC World Service, Arabic service, it is stopped? There is a technical fault for it? So Ms. Ali said, yes. On 23rd of March at 7:15 to 7:16 or something, it was stopped a second time, a third time. I was sitting there and I asked Lord Everbury if he would ask the question in English and have an answer in English. The media was all there, and Ms. Harry said the same answer. The next day, all hell broke loose. In the House of Parliament, in the media, they said, what's this? Saudi Arabia is censoring the BBC World Service. So the BBC World Service, Arabic, was closed. The journalists were fired, and Al Jazeera was born. So everybody moved from London to Al Jazeera, all the people, and that's how Al Jazeera began. Now, I don't know whether this is jamming or censorship or what, but this is one of the issues which, in some other countries, especially in Egypt nowadays, and in Iraq indeed, the easier way of doing it is you kill the journalist. You just shoot him, and then let the world complain about it. There is another way of doing it, is you close the station. There's always a reason you can close a station, and that will bring us into the domestic level of the law. The domestic level of the law, they're in almost all the countries, in Britain, in Europe, in the States, and indeed in all the Arab countries. They have legislation which deals with radio and television and satellite. It's a regulatory matter. So it sets out how you apply for the station. It sets out what you can and what you cannot do with the station. Usually it has all the nice words about hate and about discrimination and about you shouldn't be doing anything which creates a problem on the level of the society. And it also gives the regulator the power to penalize the station. And the penalty, generally speaking, it could be either a fine or sometimes imprisonment if it gets worse. And the last step is to close the station, to withdraw the license. We practice this in the UK, in Europe, and in all the other countries, and indeed in the Arab countries. And Egypt has gone far beyond anybody else in this respect, because following the coup d'etat of Sisi, they've closed, I can't remember the figure, but something like 10 or 15 TV stations. They've closed newspapers, they closed all sorts of other things. Now, the regulator under the law of these countries can do these things. It has the powers, all these powers to do that. But it is always the problem is with the interpretation of how you apply it. And I will give you an example here in England, which happened recently. There is an Arab station which is called FADAK, F-A-D-A-K, FADAK. It is owned and led by a cleric who is Shiite by sect, and he has his preachers offends the other Muslims. It offends the Sunnis because he accuses Umar and Abu Bakr and all the things which are not acceptable. The British government hasn't done anything about it. There were some complaints, but no action was taken. This station has now bought a place in one of the villages, one of the English traditional village in London. It's a huge area, and they always have large events. So the people in the village decided they don't want this thing here. They have made complaints to a variety of levels, to the council, they made a complaint to the regulator, to Ofcom, they made complaint to the police, they made all the complaints. At the end of the day, the station is still there because the response of Ofcom is that, first of all, this station is not for the public here. So since it is not for the public here, it doesn't come under our jurisdiction. Now, the same Ofcom had a slightly different view when it was the Iranian station, which is called Press TV. With Press TV, they had a different view on it. So there is this selection or election of how you apply the rules in applying the law on the domestic one. You have also the interpretation of what do you object to. For instance, if there is a station which shows witchcraft, sihr and all the other things, how do you deal with that one? What do you do with a station which broadcasts religious teachings, but it is unacceptable to the other side or some other people? The discrimination on a variety of levels. So the interpretation, I'm trying just to show how difficult it is, and we're still at the domestic level, and we're still looking at one country within the country, and we are applying the same law in theory to everybody, and we have these differences and difficulties. And I'm talking about a country where the rule of law, and this is not being biased, but honestly, in my view, I think the country that has the highest standard of rule of law is this country. We have a higher standard than in continental Europe. We have a higher standard than the USA, and certainly we have a higher standard than the Arab countries. And yet we have these problems. Now, when you look at the situation in the Arab countries, we don't have the sophistication of the law. We do not have the sophistication of the judiciary. And there is a very subjective view of looking at issues of this nature. So when you have all these elements into it, you can see why the difficulty, where the difficulty comes from. Now, they have tried in the Arab countries to do something which is code of ethics. They call it mithaq al-sharaf, or self-regulation. They produced this one. There are a number of them. There is one which was done by the ministers of information, the Arab ministers of information. There's another one which was done by the private suppliers like Nilesat and the Arabsat. They've signed this. But this really brings us to the issue. On the assumption that we are all in agreement that jamming is an unlawful or wrong, it's a wrongful act. If we agree that this is the position, we have to look at who is doing the wrongful act. And that is our biggest problem. Because on the viruses, on the computers, and on the idea that we have hackers and what have you, it is usually criminals or individuals or smaller groups. The jamming is almost universally, it's a government thing. I know we've talked about jamming for commercial reasons, but it is usually either by the government itself or by one of its elements so that the government doesn't get involved, or they acquiesce and they pretend it's not there. That's why we've heard in the morning about the various locations in Cairo, and there are other locations in various places. Now, if we have the problem with the government, and governments have sovereignty, so it doesn't matter what laws we have, whether it's international or domestic, it is going to be very difficult to go to a court in Switzerland or Britain or France or anywhere to sue the government of Iran or Egypt or any other government because they have the sovereign immunity. And I'm making this assumption that the jamming is done by governments. I'm sure even if it is done that way, any government worth its salt, it will not do it by the Ministry of Information. They will create a small company and they jam it, and It's nothing to do with the government. The government can't swear they have nothing to do with it, and they cannot find it, and it is behind the bakery, as we heard, you know, the address, it's behind the bakery next to the restaurant of I don't know what. Now, the BBC World Service, the Arabic service, have a very, very good program. It's aired, I think, very shortly, a few days ago. It's called Athir al-Karahiyya, which is air of hate. A journalist from the BBC Arabic service looked at the hate programs, and he's looking specifically at what Shiites are doing to the Sunnis and the Sunnis are doing to the Shiites. And he went to Kuwait, he went to Egypt, he went to various other places, and he's done the UK bit here. But the defense of the station, which I referred to earlier, which is FEDAC, according to Ofcom, it doesn't broadcast for here. But in fact, anybody who has a satellite can see it, and anybody who has a computer can see it, and on the YouTube it's going to be here. But it's being broadcasted here in England. Now, let's move to the international level. On the international level, there is, first of all, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, I'll read you the text of it because it should be helpful. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Now, this is a very clear statement, but it has the usual problems of international law. International law has no teeth, it has no authority to apply it, because the violation is usually done by states, and states have sovereign immunity. So even if we enhance this text, and even if we produce another agreement, and let's assume this agreement, and incidentally, this declaration, the Universal Declaration, is signed by Egypt, signed by all the Arab countries. They all have this obligation in their law, and they all have it they have an enabling act. So Egypt would issue a law which says that we hereby ratify the Universal Declaration, and it becomes part of the Egyptian law. So in theory, a lawyer can go to the Egyptian court and say that, you know, Al Jazeera or any station can go to the Egyptian court and say, please, can you let our cameramen and reporters out of prison? That's one. And the second one, can you please stop interfering with the right that we have under the convention? But obviously, we can't be naive to actually believe that this is what happens. Because if we look at many other things, and I'm not trying to neither deviate nor undermine what we are talking about, the jamming of satellites. But if you look at the Geneva Convention, at the Vienna Convention, at the Rome Treaty, at the rights of the child, and all these things which has less political element into it, and people don't apply it. Israel never applies the Geneva Convention to the Palestinians. Maliki never do that. I don't know. It's not Sisi now. We are still with the other president, the temporary president. They don't apply any of these things to the people. So the idea that we can have a document or an agreement or a convention that stops that, it is intellectually it is good. It is possible. But in practice, I have a doubt how we are going to apply it. Now, having said all that, I honestly do not think that you should take my word for it and we stop here and we say, sorry, it's not going to work. No. Because there is the concept of naming and shaming. If all these countries which talks about freedom and democracy, I know they have Guantanamo, but this is their problem. But the USA can actually say to the various states that, you know, we've noticed that you are in breach of this, and this is going to affect the relationship, whether it's commercial or politics or supply of arms or whatever. So there is this element that can be applied, the pressure can be applied. How am I doing it? Okay?
Yes, that's fine.
All right. So we can have pressure from governments. This is number one. Number two, I think the people who are in the media, and the people who are in human rights, and the people who are activists in politics generally, should make this point on the agenda, because if we put it on the agenda, at least we will get these states to become on the defensive side. And this is one of the things that we can do. Now, if we cannot have the whole weight of the law behind us, what's used to be called the civilized world, the democratic countries, should actually do that. Although, saying that, I am not so sure that the countries are actually willing to do that unless it fits with their policy. So, for instance, Saudi Arabia, as far as the Western concept is concerned, is a good country. And it's a modern country, and it's an element of stabilization in the region. And Iran is the bad guys. By the way, I'm an enemy of Iran for my own reason, because I'm an Iraqi and they occupy my country. But that's a different issue. But Iran is much more advanced in terms of freedoms, democracy, women's rights, all these things. Much, much more advanced than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, you even have a separate bank for men and women. And you can't drive and you cannot do this, that, and that. But nevertheless, because Saudi Arabia is pro-West, then we can swallow a lot of these things. So tomorrow, if there are free jamming from Saudi Arabia, we will probably not say it. But if there's jamming from Iran, and Iran is the bad guys, then we will raise the issue. But nevertheless, I think the countries have a duty. I'm probably drawing a little too negative a picture, but I think these countries, generally speaking, and public opinion, because these are democratic countries, so even if we have a Tony Blair here who doesn't listen to people, but still people can express their views and they will affect the politics. Aside from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, there are the regional one. You've got the UNESCO has some provisions which deals with the freedom of expression. We have on the EU, we have the EU TV transmission, and also we have even the Arabs have the ASBO, which is the Arab Satellite Broadcasting Organization, something. You have the International Telecom Union. All these organizations have documents, but it needs to be applied. And I think because they have no mandate to apply it, they have no sanctions to apply, we, the people, can actually put pressure on the governments and on these organizations. If we keep on shaming them, what are you doing about it? You know, why are you not saying anything about the jamming? Why is the UN not talking about it? Why is the ITU is not talking about it? Why the Arabs are not talking? Despite the fact that we've just seen the Arab conference here, they have agreed to fight terrorism. And that's another one which needs definition. I don't know what terrorism is, by whose standard, which side of the fence you are on. So I think the summing up is that there is a vacuum. There are 2-3 documents, but they are not sufficient. They have no teeth, they have no power to enforce them, but I think they can be made more effective. We can play a role, and we can influence our governments and our parliaments and the activists. And I think the media people should actually raise awareness, although the media is sometimes culprit in producing things which meets its policies. I'm invited to go to different television stations, and I have to be careful what I say on one television station I cannot say on the other one. So, although I try to say what I think of, and everybody says, yeah, you can say anything you want, but in fact, it's not correct. They can't do that. So, but the media itself can play a major role by raising awareness of people and trying to push for change in the law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saba, for that very rich.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, thank you very much, Dawood, and thanks for organizing this very important workshop. To appreciate what we're doing, it might be worth remembering that the satellite revolution probably goes back to the early 90s. What it did actually was to break the monopoly of governments over information through TV. Prior to satellite, each government in the Arab region, I'm here speaking specifically about the Arab region, each government had an official radio and an official TV channel, or probably a couple of radios and a couple of TVs. That's all. Citizens had no access to other sources of information through television apart from the government-controlled media. Newspapers in much of the Arab world were also under the control of governments and were under the mercy of censors who were usually part of the information ministry. So satellite and internet, the same decade, they came and they broke that monopoly by governments who happened to be generally despotic and corrupt. So as they try to jam us or interfere with our transmission, they want to reinstate their monopoly over information. So we're talking here about, generally in our business, we're talking about three main actors. There are these governments who are suspected of interference. There are the service providers, people through whom a channel like mine managed to find a space on a satellite here or there to reach our audience in a particular region or around the world. And there are the broadcasters, people like us in TV channels. Since morning we've touched on governments suspected of jamming TV transmission, and we've spoken as broadcasters, and we've expressed our concern and hopes in finding a solution to this problem. But we have touched very little on the service providers who are part of this equation. And service providers, to the best of my knowledge, can be categorized into two categories. There are the satellite owners themselves, and these satellite owners sublet to service providers. Service providers in the Arab region are very vulnerable and susceptible to government pressure, and this is a major source of weakness. We've had this experience ourselves whenever we are interfered with, whenever our transmission is jammed, and we enter into a discussion with the service provider, we can easily detect that there is government pressure somewhere, that they don't have the freedom to even maneuver For instance, this is how it works. They target a transmission, and that transponder usually, that is usually targeted, will have, say, 12 channels. The entire channels become affected, and in order to relieve the other channels who are not the primary target of jamming, you get unplugged. So they unplug you. In this case, they unplug Al-Hawar, for instance. And then they'll, as my colleague Adnan said in the morning, they come to us and say, there's a problem with your content. So you have to stop transmitting this particular program. For instance, once we were jammed by the Libyans because we interviewed a member of the opposition. And whenever there was a repeat of the program, jamming resumed. The argument from the service providers that don't broadcast this interview. The interview is the problem. So they use it as a pressure. Now, service providers don't have the ability to argue with governments, because governments can close them down. They can withdraw their licenses. So service providers or subletters in the Arab region are very weak service providers. They are incapable of guaranteeing the continuation of their service. I think, Dr. Dawood, you tried to invite to this workshop a number of service providers from the Middle East region, and I think none of them expressed readiness or willingness to come. If you correct me if I'm wrong, you invited GulfSat, NurSat, ArabSat, Sohail also. So we wanted to have a discussion with them. We wanted to have a debate with them to see, this is a common problem. This is a mutual problem for all of us. And we need to sit together in a workshop like this to discuss the issue. I'm glad we've managed to hold this function today, but it is far from enough, and that's why I suggested to my colleague Ibrahim earlier in the day that probably Al Jazeera should organize a bigger conference somewhere in the Middle East, maybe in Doha, because that might convince some of the service providers to come. So we need to enter into some sort of dialogue with the service providers to see how we can help them and they can help us, and we can help each other together in finding some practical solutions. I'm not a technical man. Ibrahim has spoken about some of the issues that have been adopted. But what I can say to you is that in Al-Hawar, which is a very low budget channel, jamming has been extremely costly for us. We lost many of our original frequencies, and then we had to go and shop for new frequencies. We lost our viewers in certain parts of the world, especially in Morocco and North Africa, until people find you again, and some of the frequencies do not reach certain regions easily, and we had to compensate through streaming, internet streaming. It's a very costly thing. So if you have just a few million pounds as an annual budget for a channel, and then more than half of this budget had to be spent on satellites in order to guarantee that we reach our viewers. We are now on 5 frequencies, which is very costly. It's too costly. When we started in 2006, we had only 2 frequencies, one on Nilesat and one on Hotbird. And we thought through Nilesat and Hotbird we covered the areas where most Arabs exist, because we are an Arabic channel. And then on the 1st of April 2008, Hosni Mubarak issued his directive, and this is what the service provider told us at the time, that these were instructions from the highest authority in Egypt. Pull the plug. That they didn't want Al-Hawar to be on Nilesat. And then we discovered a couple of days later that our frequency was given to Fox Movies, which is owned by Al-Walid bin Talal, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Did they pull the plug because they wanted to give our frequency, which was a very good frequency? People could watch us from Mauritania all the way to Afghanistan, to give it to Fox Movies because that was probably a worthier cause to them? We are not sure. Or is it because I had just finished interviewing Al-Murshid Al-Am of Al-Ikhwan Al-Muslimin in Egypt, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, Muhammad Mahdi Akif, who happens to be in prison at the moment, by the way, and he is now 87 years old. Egypt is a madhouse at the moment. Anyways, anything is possible. But we are not sure why they pulled the plug. So it could be this, could be our program, Awraq Masriya, but that's what they did. And the service provider at the time couldn't do much about it, couldn't help us, because they couldn't face up to the Egyptian government. Governments can close offices, can imprison journalists, as we've seen. They use all sorts of pressure and blackmail and threats in order to silence people. So I think from my perspective, one of the things that we need to do is to continue to organize workshops, seminars, conferences, and encourage people who are involved in any part of this business to come and join us. And we need also to have lawyers with us, because we need to also explore legal avenues. There must be a way of sometime in the near future, hopefully, of categorizing this or designating this as a crime in international law. Once it becomes a crime in international law, then governments will think twice or thrice before they try to jam, to interfere and block frequencies. Now, finally, there is another aspect which we haven't dealt with today, and probably we hope to be able to deal with in the future, but I think we need maybe experts on this region, is that sometimes jamming is done by third parties and not done by governments themselves. We had the experience that when we were once jammed, we thought we were jammed by Libya. Although we were jammed by Libya at one stage under Gaddafi. But then one of the companies we employed the services to find out where the jamming was coming from, they thought it was coming from somewhere in the former republics of the Soviet Union. So this, and I heard some people interested in this say that there are groups or companies or freelancers who actually do this if paid by governments to do it from different locations. I don't know how this works technically, but this is what we were told at the time. So there are freelancers who jam and interfere with frequencies on behalf of governments who pay them to do this. In final conclusion, I'm very glad that we've managed to meet together today in this workshop, and I would encourage our much bigger brothers in the business or sisters, BBC, Al Jazeera, and these major satellite channels and much bigger businesses to pursue this line to help themselves and help us, because we need their help in order to continue surviving in this very difficult world. Maybe some of you know Al-Hawar, but just a few words why it is important for Al-Hawar to survive. Al-Hawar is a human rights defender and an advocator of democratization in the Arab region, and that's why governments don't like us. That's why they've been jamming us. And Ustaz Sabah Al-Mukhtar is a regular guest on our channel, and he knows we have a margin of freedom on Al-Hawar that you cannot find in any other Arab channel. And that is, and I'm proud to admit this, that is because we are in the UK. Had we been anywhere else, probably we would have been closed down a long time ago. But when you are in a country where relatively speaking, the rule of the law is well established, then that provides you with protection, and we have been provided with protection. Zain al-Abidin bin Ali tried to, through complaints, repeated complaints to Ofcom, to interrupt our transmission, and he did not succeed, because there is rule of law in this country, and if you are not guilty unless you are proven as such. So Al-Hiwar is vital, especially during this time where we hope to see the Arab Spring relaunch and hopefully reach areas where it hasn't reached yet, areas where the plot against democracy in Egypt was hatched, countries where the conspiracy to remove the democratically elected president in Egypt were plotted in the first place. I'm referring here to Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. We hope to see the Arab Spring reach those places and many other places, and that's why we need to remain in this business, and we need to survive, and we need your help and assistance in all of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azam. We'll open the floor for questions and comments in a while, but as you can see, there is an element from his presentation which was not addressed this morning, and that was the role of the service providers, their importance, how they are being pressured and blackmailed across the region in order to interfere with broadcasts. And so it's a huge challenge now to enable and empower these providers to remain independent and to ensure that they can offer their services. But very interestingly, I think one of the features of his presentation which caught my mind was also the privatization of the service, where governments can actually employ a private company to carry out this act of interference and jamming. And in a sense, it's not surprising, because we had private armies occupying Iraq and Afghanistan. You see, soldiers of fortune going to these countries on the payroll of governments in the West. And so it's not beyond governments in the West and in the Middle East to employ these companies and, you know, to do this dirty job, as it were. There's I have no doubt that there's much room for discussion, and so I open the floor now for your comments and questions. Adnan, please.
As we've heard this morning, technically there are ways of maybe protecting the jamming, and the legal side was spoken about. What would be steps forward to put pressure politically on stopping jamming?
Well, I think several things can bring about political pressure. When Al Jazeera announced their investigation of of the sources of jamming immediately stopped. I'm sure that the Egyptians felt that this was serious, what they were getting into. We also in Al-Hiwar haven't been jammed by the Egyptians since then. And that's thanks to the efforts made by Al Jazeera through was it a French company? Was it?
Yeah, it is based in France.
Yeah, that investigated.
United States origin state.
Yeah. So I think the trying to expose, that creates political pressure. Also, conventions of global dimension will bring about pressure, because we are speaking out, we are making our grievances heard, and hopefully this will have an impact on public opinion, if not in every place, but in certain places. We need also to find out avenues for political pressure through international relations. And probably that's an aspect that we need maybe to take into consideration next time we meet in a workshop like this. For instance, in the relations between governments, what avenues do exist? How can we get more governments, heavyweight governments, interested in this topic, and therefore tell their friends who come from the Middle East when they meet them that this is not good what you're doing, you better stop it. Just as they criticize sometimes human rights violations, as they criticize certain practices. If my colleagues have other suggestions, please.
Yes, please.
Well, I'd say it'd be interesting to look at what happened with internet service providers only a few years ago, where you had a similar situation of companies capitulating to governments, China in particular. There was the Shi Tao case, who was the journalist who was arrested in China, and there were very strong allegations that Yahoo had given the contents of his emails to the Chinese government, leading to him being arrested. And I was working with Amnesty International at the time, and a big report was produced that had lots of information about what the Chinese government was doing, and then hidden away, around 30 pages into it, was what the companies were doing. The press release was put out criticising the Chinese government. It got a little bit of pickup, and then the tech journalists read through it and found the bit about the companies, and suddenly that became far, far bigger, because actually in general people don't necessarily expect governments to act any differently. But they do, in some cases, expect companies to act differently. They expect companies to act the same in different countries, and you can find areas of pressure on that. It was hugely embarrassing to Yahoo. When Google introduced their censored search engine in China, that lasted around 6 months until they realized that the negative response to that was so big it was damaging their brand. More recently, with the NSA revelations about what's, the backdoors in systems, Google has introduced a far more secure email system, and they've started to encrypt their emails, finally, which is something people have been arguing for years, but is also a very dangerous thing for governments, because actually you just need to go back to the end of the 1980s. The US banned encrypted emails, so they were illegal, which is one of the reasons they didn't become standard, because at the time the internet was very much focused in the US. That's where the greatest number of users, and the government absolutely recognized that people passing information without them being able to see it was a problem. So I wasn't surprised when the NSA stuff came out, because it has its roots absolutely in that period. The only reason you would ban encryption is because you plan to read people's emails. But the pressure on the companies, the thing to be aware of in that is actually, if you look back at that situation and look at the companies who are most willing to change and to adapt in response to public pressure, what you then start to create is monopoly. Because Google have been the ones who've been most willing to change and to adapt, whereas Yahoo is nowhere now. Yahoo's been on a year-on-year decline. People don't use their email anymore. So the difficulty with that is that as you start to criticize service providers, you can create a situation where actually the power becomes concentrated more and more and more within one or two companies. They may be the most ethical. They may start to act most ethically because they build that muscle globally by being bigger and bigger. But then obviously the danger is then on the business side that they start to become the monopoly and they start to exploit the companies that are expecting to use them. So it's always difficult in that kind of commercial level, business level pressure, but it can achieve some things, particularly well-known providers. If their name is known outside of those countries, that's where you can put pressure. You can get consumers in different countries to put pressure and saying what you're doing there is not acceptable to me here.
Thank you.
From our experience, I remember that when we were removed from Nilesat, many human rights organizations sympathized with us, actually, because we informed them about it, and they issued statements. So we need also to involve them with us, probably. Maybe we should have invited some of them, because that's a matter of concern to them. It's a question of a human right. Mm-hmm. So they do, from experience, they do get involved if we alert them or if we involve them.
Well, I think this is all we have time for. I should therefore take the opportunity to thank every one of you for attending and staying throughout the day and participating in the discussions. The presentations were quite enlightening, and the discussions themselves have provoked immense thought, and I'm sure all the parties concerned, the stakeholders, will benefit from the final report of what transpired here today. From my own perspective, there are a number of highlights that I would just like to recall briefly, to begin with the note by Jonathan on perhaps the need to finesse Article 19, which was written in 1948, and technologies have advanced, and therefore perhaps that document which governs the dissemination of information and access to information, that document has to be revisited. We are speaking about a global problem, a problem that affects millions of people across the world. Al Jazeera has an audience of over 50 million. So there must be an international, broad collaboration between all parties on this subject. But beyond this, there is also the question of how to criminalize the phenomena of interference, of jamming, and denial of access to information. We are aware that this can occur unintentionally, but it is our view from the researches that we've done and from the reports we've had from various stations, it is often a question of intentional interference because it affects so many people across the globe. We think the time has come to examine ways to criminalize this practice. Then we came to the issue of the service providers, and I think the suggestion by Mr. Mukhtar of examining the contracts themselves, how the contracts are written, and trying to ensure that the providers do not find an easy way to renege on the obligations to the various companies. All of these are issues which we will take back, we've noted, and we will no doubt consider going forward as we suggest them to our partners at Al Jazeera, Al Hiwar, and all those affected. Once again, our heartfelt thanks to all of you, and I want to thank the staff at Memo, finally, for the dedication, their sacrifices, and their expertise in putting together this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.